First off, Doug, if you watch this, it's not I don't have a best lat exercise, right? Like we have like 500 exercises in our library. We have exercises that have attributes that can be used towards goals or whatever. And so I think it's what why not have a logical reason for the exercises that you choose and the exercises that you periodize to as well. And the other thing is that if you have an expected outcome of an exercise, it's easier to evaluate whether that exercise is effective.
Right. So there was something I wanted to ask, because you touched on, you're looking at which muscle group there is like the limiter, right? And it's going to fatigue first. And there was a thought process I had the other day that is almost certainly incorrect, but I'd almost like to elaborate on why. And I think maybe the answer is in the difference between failure versus sufficiently fatigued. So if you were to imagine, I don't know, like something being held up by like poles or whatever, and if like there's like the strongest pole there and that one breaks, and then immediately, just because all three were needed to hold them up, obviously the next two are then just going to break, right? So you had this first thing that kind of tapped out. Now, the reason I say this is almost obviously wrong is because if you do, just as like a classic example, maybe a wide grip bench has more chest emphasis and maybe a close grip bench has more triceps, or at least that's how it's typically talked about. You're already showing that even though both are used in both of these exercises, there is a difference in the emphasis, right? And you could use the same example with like foot positioning and squat or whatever. But in my mind, I'm like, okay, so inherently, once that main muscle, let's say again, a wide grip bench, once that chest taps out, right, it can't go anymore. Wouldn't the tricep almost by definition also be failing, because the tricep is working and is unable to use enough force to push it? But maybe it's failure in the same way that if I loaded 600 pounds on the bench press right now and somebody let it go, I would fail, but like the muscle wasn't sufficiently fatigued, even though I did fail the rep. Would that be a way to look at it? Like, yes, in that wide grip, the tricep is still hitting failure, but the chest failed first and was sufficiently fatigued versus the tricep was not fatigued there. Would that be an accurate way to look at it? Or would you say actually the tricep just did not hit failure still?
So I would say, in that example, it's likely that the triceps didn't hit failure. So like if you wanted to experiment with this yourself in the gym, right, is you'd be like, okay, take two exercises that isolate those muscles well, right? Like you could say, okay, I gotta, maybe I'm gonna do a chest fly and a tricep extension, right? And like, okay, these are my baseline exercises. You can see like, okay, what does a hard set of 5 or 10 or whatever rep range you want to use? Then you go do that other exercise that you're talking about to failure, and then you jump right into the exercise that you're trying to figure out, does this muscle really go to failure, and see how diminished its output is if you immediately go into that second one. Right. This is like kind of like the home experiment. So if I did a bench press and then I my chest was fatigued and then I'm tricep pushing it to try and lock out or whatever, but then I can run over and I can do like, we'll say 80% of what I normally could have done on a fresh set of tricep extensions. I obviously wasn't at a great degree of muscular fatigue there. Right. But
Muscular
if I
fatigue,
do that,
but
yeah.
Well, and again, maybe I'm just using the terms differently, but because I would agree that the triceps were not fatigued that much. But again, by definition, would they not have also failed in the same way that like I could take let's say a tricep extension and I could fail, let's say a 2-rep max, but then I could take what I could normally do for 12 reps. And because a 2-rep max is just not very fatiguing, even though I failed, I'd probably get similar reps. I mean, you could even argue, the whole like activation of it, you might even get more reps.
So it's important that we don't conflate different variables here, because so like when we say muscular failure, right, or we say like when you reach failure in an exercise, right, you have to define like that means I can no longer complete that exercise in some manner. Right. So one, like to use your pull example, let's say that like in the bench press, right, as soon as the pecs stop being able to contribute, there's only like the triceps are only so efficient that they're just doing the elbow extension, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's only so much elbow extension recruitment that can help if I've lost the ability to, flex and adduct the shoulder at this point in time,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm not going to be able to packless press press a whatever standard grip bench up in the air, right? They will be contributing to the lift, but they won't be able to do it on their own. So when we're comparing exercises and we're like, okay, what technical failure means, like we're no longer able to perform it this way. And that's likely usually because the primary mover of those is no longer able to participate enough that the synergist, no matter how much they help, cannot make it go. But the synergists aren't going to necessarily go all the way to fatigue because they haven't been working as hard during any of the reps, right? So it's not, right. So if you pick a good press exercise, it's a lot of pecs. The pecs might be working all out and the triceps are helping just as much as needed. As the pecs fatigue, the triceps start helping a little bit more, but because they were never all in and they were coming on late, right? So it's like you may not be able to do the elbow extension anymore, but the mechanism that you're not able to do the elbow extension in that press anymore is because you're not able to do enough of the shoulder flexion adduction portion to finish the lift. But you could sit there and you could like isometrically push the bar apart or whatever, because you still have plenty of, we'll say, capacity of work left in the triceps. Now, in terms of rep ranges, we look at muscular failure like specific to rep range, meaning that like, okay, there's a degree of muscular failure. You can take a 20 rep max and a 10 rep max and a 2 rep max. And that's because that failure point is determined by, if it's your 2 rep max, muscular failure is when the muscle can no longer produce enough tension to move that load, right? Let's say it's 100 pounds, right? Okay. But if we do a 10 rep max, a 10 rep load or whatever, let's say that's, 65 pounds or something like that, then it'd be like, all right, muscular failure is now when the triceps can no longer produce enough tension to move 65 pounds, right? And then your 20 rep max might be, it's when your triceps can no longer produce enough tension to move, 45 pounds or whatever. I'm just throwing those numbers out there. But so when we look at muscular failure, that is rep range specific, right? When we're looking at technical failure, that is exercise specific, but don't cross those two things over. So you would use, like, if you were going to use a rep range isolation exercise as a comparison model, right? You would be just using that as like, hey, this is just a standard of like, at this weight, I can typically do this many reps in this kind of isolated, exercise. And that can be my metric so that I can just test to see how far away, or how much decreased performance I have in that after performing another exercise immediately prior, if you will. So I don't know if that was more confusing or more helpful.
No, so we're totally on the same page conceptually of like what's happening there. Again, I think I'm just maybe using fatigue. Like I'm hearing people use fatigue and failure almost synonymously. And I guess in my head, I'm just thinking like from a literal definition, or at least how it is in my head, once the chest is, completely fatigued, well, like you said, the triceps there's not going to be enough there for them to finish that press. So again, from a literal standpoint, the triceps are failing to be able to press that by themselves. So they've failed is how I would say it, but they are not sufficiently fatigued. And so that's how I would say it.
Yeah. So fatigue can lead to failure, but failure doesn't always mean fatigue.
Right. Yeah.
Is that a good way to put it?
That's how I would say it. Yeah. Cool.
Okay.
Let's see. I had something written down here. Oh, this is actually a question on Doug's behalf because he mentioned it several times to me. So he was saying, his exercise was, I guess he calls it the pull in, and he was saying, it's not even supposed to be all the way out. It's kind of almost like a 45. I can't really show here, but he was like, kind of like a 45 degree. And he said, and Kassem saying that the best one is like, he said it's basically the exact same movement, but just out in front. And how could mine be the worst possible exercise and his is the best? So maybe you can elaborate on that.
First off, Doug, if you watch this, it's not I don't have a best lat exercise, right? Like we have like 500 exercises in our library. We have exercises that have attributes that can be used towards goals or whatever. And so I think it's funny that because I'd been critical of the pull-in, that now he's comparing it just to an exercise of mine that he's happened to see on social media, as if like, because there is no Kassem pull down, right? There is no like, hey, this is my favorite lat exercise, and that's the one that you do. It's like, no, we have exercises that challenge different parts of the lat or the delts or the teres or whatever, and they